Hello and welcome to Archetypal Hour. My name is Adam, Archetype, uh, and this transmission is being broadcast live on the Broom Radio. And I am joined by Lexi, and we are in the Moon channel in the Pod Discord server. And this transmission is, I think, hopefully an introduction of sorts to two other conversations that I'll be having as with Hoda, Intrepid Bodies, and Nobu, Jimmy Chan, about what has been the thread that started from Freeway Book Club, The Signal and the Noise, and the general theme of this series or mini series is a focus on communication, really, with the unseen realities, so to speak. Um, and so this will hopefully be a little bit of an introduction of sort of that topic. And it has some spicy thoughts. So I'm very curious to see how it lands with those that are with me live, but also with anyone that's listening to this transmission and wants to share. And we'll start a thread, of course, as always. Or you can put comments in YouTube or Spotify, wherever you might be listening. But yeah, and so this, I was kind of surprised. This text is sort of what I'm using as a background, the one that I haven't even said out loud. Sorry. So I have in front of me this book called The Eleusinian and Bacchic Mysteries by Thomas Taylor. Thomas Taylor was a Platonist, not a platypus, but a Platonist, a student of Plato, I guess you could say, someone who studied and read a lot of all of his material and translated a lot of it. He was also a translator. He was English. He was born in 1758. And this particular text, which is called like the Dissertation on the Eleusinian and Bacchic Mysteries, was published in London in 1791. And it's a really strange text. I got it on Father's Day from a cool bookstore that I frequent. Hey, Hoda, welcome to the live space. And it had some spicy things that felt really timely based on the other insights and gnosis that were being shared here, and namely some of the amazing stuff that was being shared in Why Am I Like This by Nobu, particularly on death and on hell. And I was really surprised. I was always really interested in these mysteries, these Greek mysteries. They're mentioned in The Golden Ass, which was a Latin novel that I was reading and really enjoying. I mostly was reading for the myth of Psyche and Cupid. And in it, the main character, which is loosely based off of the author, had been initiated into the mysteries. And it's mentioned a couple times that this initiation into the mysteries would sort of conferred some sort of wisdom or refinement on his part. And there were sort of the lesser mysteries that a lot of people participated in, and the so-called greater mysteries. And these traditions started in Greece or probably somewhere else before, but at least for purposes of this particular book, were Greek, and then also became Roman as well, traditions and practices. And there's some really juicy stuff in this book, which is kind of like, if I were to shorten it, would be like, we're in Hades already, right? We're in hell already. And so that's why I sort of was laughing, because it was felt really connected to a joke that had started about hell and then turned into like a real good why am I like this question, and this amazing gnosis that was shared. And so I'm going to read a couple of excerpts from this. And it's from a Twitter thread that I've been putting together. But the hope here is to, I'd say, just to ground this once again in what I was talking about at the beginning, which is about being able to separate the noise from the actual signal, to tune in to the realities. And how this text, I think, is offering some unique perspectives by way of the myths and the mysteries that were built around the myths. particularly the myth of Persephone or Proserpine or Cora, um, goddess of spring and fertility in that regard, who in the myth was abducted by Pluto or Hades in the Greek, the god of the underworld and also the underworld itself. And he was abducted and he raped her in the most of the myths. And then she is searched for by her mother, Demeter or Ceres in Roman. And then, as the myth ends, she is brought back up to the overworld, but having eaten in the underworld, she has to spend time there. And so she ends up both this goddess of spring as well as the queen of the underworld. And so this was one of the myths that these mysteries were built around. And they would be drinking and they would be performing theater and dramatizations of these myths. So this book is really talking about why they were doing that and like what information or what sort of gnosis or what experience are they trying to impart at a deeper level besides sort of like just the base level of what was happening in those events. And so I'm going to read a couple of these things, and then I just want to like take a break and open it up. But actually, before I do that, let me also welcome. Oh, Lump is here too. Welcome, Lump. And so I'm just, for those that just joined, I'm just going to be sharing some excerpts from this book, and we are going to be just discussing it in the context of what it brings up for us, but also what this might mean in terms of our own practices, our own process of refining communication with we might say our vaster self. This book uses the terminology of soul a lot. But this sort of deeper part of us that we are trying to facilitate communication with, as well as the other unseen realities and entities that might support that effort of which this text is really about, I think, which is about the liberation of the soul. Hello. Okay, so I'm going to read some of this, and then I want to just take some breaks to see what comes up. And so it starts with you talking about how like some of this is seen in some of the poems. If you like, he's always, this Taylor is trying to connect the deeper mythos that all these rites and initiations and mysteries are built off of. And so he's talking about how it shows up in Virgil in the Aeneid poem. And the quote says, "Easy is the path that leads down to hell. Grim Pluto's gate stands open night and day. But to retrace one's steps and escape to the upper regions, this is a work. This is a task. Some few, whom favoring Jove loved or illustrious virtue advanced to heaven, the sons of the gods, have effected it. Woods cover all the intervening space, and the river Cocytus, gliding with his black, winding flood, surrounds it." This is Virgil, and I'm going to put this thread into the chat for anyone that wants to follow along, and I'd love maybe some help reading if someone wants to do that. So this is talking about sort of the entrance to hell, to Hades, and how difficult it is to ascend out of it, which many heroes have done in the different Greek stories and mythologies. And now Taylor starts to talk about like the more like deeper esoteric meaning behind some of these things when he says, "But when he says that all the middle regions are covered in woods, this intimates a material nature and implies nothing more than the passage leading to the barathrum or the abyss of body, i.e., into profound darkness and oblivion. And this medium is surrounded by the black bosom of Cocytus, that is, by bitter weeping and lamentations, the necessary consequence of the soul's union with a nature entirely foreign to her own." And so, like, what they're saying is, kind of spicy in that, like, in a way, the incarnation process is like a death for the soul. It's like a punishment for the soul. in many ways to be enfleshed. And here's another quote as he's sort of sharing like how this is what was the sort of wisdom that was brought by this group of people that he was so love of studying around Plato. This is Philolaus said, the ancient theologists and prophets also testify that the soul is united with the body as if by way of punishment, and so is buried in body as in a sepulchre, a tomb. And here's another one last quote, and I'll stop because they're all saying the same thing basically. The soul therefore dies as much as it is possible for the soul to die, and the death to her is, while baptized or immersed in the present body, to descend into matter and be wholly subjected by it, and after departing thence to lie there till it shall arise and turn its face away from the abhorrent filth. That is what is meant by the falling asleep in Hades of those who have come there. So I'm curious, like, this is a little bit spicy to speak in this way about like the soul coming down into the body as like a painful process and like a death for the soul, so to speak. And I'm just kind of curious what that brings up for folks um, as like a starting point, because it is a pretty spicy thing to say, I think. Yeah, there's processing happening in the chat, which I appreciate because I feel like, as usual, the things I'm bringing as seeds into this container to discuss are things that I've been sitting with for a while. So, yeah, I want to hold space. And I'll just share like a little bit while folks are typing their reflections. Oh, actually, yeah. So I'm likening that from a smaller scale to the larger idea of a human soul. Oh, sorry. For me, it does align that this is Hoda speaking. For me, it does align that embodiment can be a difficult process. So I'm likening that from a similar scale to the larger idea of a human soul descending into the body. Yeah, that's exactly what I think this is saying. That this process, that in some ways, like, I just think it's very interesting because I do think that a lot of like I would say new age conversation or discourse around reincarnation is often in a very positive light, right? Like we chose our parents and we chose to come to this experience, and all these things were chosen by the higher self, or you know, um, and I find that I'm not saying that that's incorrect, but I do find that sometimes that is like maybe obscuring other things that are at play here. But even if that's to be said, that there's a choice there, and that it's all pleasurable, and everything's honky dory, it's still painful for the soul to be, uh, in this body, feeling all these things, and being in this reality, this harsh world. I would say, at least that's how I've experienced it, and it seems like it's the general experience of many in current time and in past time. Um, and so, yeah, I think like that's what was coming up for me too, which is like it felt a little bit more like I don't know. For me, it felt like um, it felt true and it felt sad, but that doesn't necessarily mean it wasn't a choice. And I think it also to me spoke to this connection that I thought when bringing this text into this conversation within this sort of like internal line of communication, this channel to be able to be fully present with the full reality, and how that full reality requires the soul, and that the soul can be kind of lost within the body, within sort of all the other things that are happening, um, with regards to being incarnate, being embodied, being a human, being overwhelmed and overflooded with all these sensory information, and all the things that can sort of, I'd say, maybe keep us from hearing or keep us from feeling tuned in to the larger reality and finding balance and harmony through that connection. And how, if the soul is sort of like in a difficult space, like this process, and how these mysteries in this book or whatever are really talking about this ability to re-find the connection to what has been sort of separated, to bring back together union, which I think shows up in a lot of practices and lineages in terms of core messaging of reconnecting. Hoda says, yeah, that's the basis of practicing to me, to reconnect. Yes, to remember, she says. That's beautiful. And as I finished reading out your loud, Turquoise wanted to come say something too. This is my parakeet. What's up, Turquoise? So it sounds like a agreement from avian wisdom to me. And yeah, so like in these mysteries, a lot of like what he says they're pulling us to, this story is about the mother, Ceres, Demeter, uh, the goddess of the grain, and also like a lot of agriculture, and I'd say like farming kind of goddess energy there. That connection with Earth. Um, that in this sort of tradition, he's saying, part of the mysteries is that her rescuing Persephone is this process of the rescue of the soul in the human experience, and how the part that is rescuing is the mother of the soul, right? Of that which the soul came from, which is where, the higher realities that it exists in. And it's never actually not separate from. And there's some good quotes there that come later about how that it's actually all still connection. It's sort of remembering, as Hoda says, versus, um, you know, recombining. Like, that Demeter Ceres represents this like higher intuitive capacity, which is funny because I'm realizing from this book that this is usually just translated in English as intellect. And intellect feels like one of those things, an intellectual. And how it's funny that like in this position, he's saying that like the roots of the word and like the closest English translation of intellectual, there's some great footnotes in this book about how Taylor really was speaking more of like spiritual when he says intellectual, because in this tradition, in the Platonic tradition, like the highest high is nous, of like, or like one of the, like on the way to the monad, of onto the way to the one, is intellect. Like this sort of, that's the word they use for this pure existence. And so the like translation is almost better to just think of like a spiritual, but so he uses like this phrase like intuitive faculty, this ability to basically like have discernment, to have a clean chance, to have this Ceres, this intuitive faculty, this the mother that's able to rescue the soul, this higher uh, sort of way of communicating with reality, and seeing, to be able to use that to help rescue the soul. Yeah, it's an interesting connection. She says Ceres is intuitive intellect. Yeah, and so I'm going to read some of the piece on that. And again, those reading this, like, I would say this myth, this reading, I don't read this as someone who is an archaeologist or an academic. So, like, to me, I would say, like, I would love to see disagreement about, like, his chops as an interpretive person of ancient Greek, whatever. But, like, for me, like, I just find that what this book pointed me to really interesting. So I want to share, but I don't want anyone to feel like they should get hung up on the way that these particular gods are interpreted in this text, because it's just one of many perspectives around it. And so, to ground this here, I'm going to start with a quote that sums up like what they think that these mysteries are pointing people to. And this is from another English person named Benjamin Franklin Cocker in the book Greek Philosophy, so more English. And he says, when the person, his understanding of all of what the mysteries were pointing to, when the person turns the back upon their higher faculties and disregards the communication which they receive through them from the world of unseen realities, an oblivion ensues of their existence. They are next brought within the province and operation of lower and worldly ambitions, such as love of power, passion for riches, sensual pleasure, etc. This is a descent, a fall, or an apostasy of the soul, a separation from the sources of divine life, and ravishment into the region of moral death. And so, like, he sees this myth, which again, like the central myth in these was Persephone, or Cora, or Proserpine, was abducted by Hades, Pluto, and her mother, Demeter, or Ceres, was searching for her and finding her in the underworld and retrieving her back. And the Greek tradition, like the kind of like people say, oh, this myth is just to sort of explain the seasons changing, which I think it does also. But he's saying that this deeper myth, which is in these mysteries, is about the process of one's intuitive intellect rescuing their divinity or their soul from Hades, for the Hades experience of corporeal form in the body. And in it, Ceres represents the evolution of the intuitional part of our nature, which we properly denominate intellect, or the unfolding of the intuitional faculty of the mind from its quiet and collected condition in the world of thought. And Proserpine, or Persephone, as that living, self-moving, and animating part, which we call the soul. But Pluto signifies the whole of a material nature, since this and since the empire of this god, according to Pythagoras, commences downward from the galaxy or from Milky Way. So this is sort of like explaining some of the cosmology and how this myth is both like speaking to about the gods and about the functions of sort of the functionings of the divine, right? And then also the human experience, the human liberation of the soul in the way of life and connecting to these unseen realities. Yeah, Hoda says spicy to take it from a nature based myth to a cosmic kind of nature. Yeah. Yeah, because like I think the text brings this up, but I might have just been something that kept popping in my mind as I read this. But like how the myth could also be like a seed, right? Like just like Persephone, the seed is goes underground where it's dark and it's damp and it consumes down there, and then it's able to come burst through back through the ground and earth and sprout and leaf and branch and grow in nature, right? In life, and get the sunlight once again, and create a plant, which it had come from originally, right? It was a seed. It had already started from that experience, and now is being seeded. So, like, I think to me, these myths are also bringing in how that relates to the human incarnation process of this part of divinity that's being seeded potentially in the underworld. We're all in different soil, and then it's sprouting as it resurrects and brings new life and plants new seeds and recurs. And it says, I guess what's interesting to me is that I don't feel like there's any intuitive faculty without a generative connection to the underworld. I still feel like all intuitive faculties are born from the underworld. But that's just my opinion. LOL. Yeah, no, I would love to hear more about this because I feel like what this is saying doesn't necessarily disagree with that. But I also am really curious. Yeah, if you want to say anything more about that, I really like that. And I see there's more typing, so I'm going to let it sit. And invite anyone else to feel like they want to come off mute, if they want to share anything that comes up for them. I'm just going to repeat what she said. I guess what's interesting to me is that I don't feel like there's any intuitive faculty without a generative connection to the underworld. I still feel like all intuitive faculties are born from the underworld. But that's just my opinion. LOL. Yeah, I'm trying to tease out why I feel like this text is creating a separation between intuitive faculty and the underworld. Well, it is kind of. Yeah, I think you're right. It is creating a separation there. That's true. Um, or at least in my opinion, because you sort of like you have Ceres, his daughter, right? So like this idea of like Persephone and her mother having this strong bond, and now there's a separation, right? She's abducted and she's taken down into the underworld with Hades. Um, and then she goes and searches all over the earth for her, can't find her, and has to go down into the underworld to retrieve her. And when she does, she's able to retrieve her, but she's not able to come up all the time. She has to now be of the underworld and of the overworld and the heavens as well. And so she rules as queen of the underworld for half of the year. And so I do think that's like a generative connection. You're right, it is a separation, but then I think there's a reconnection there where now Persephone is able to be with her, but she also has to be in the underworld. And so, like, this sort of Persephone making this descent and ascent in the cyclical way to me feels like this, like you said, this deep connection between our own underworld and the underworld, and our higher intuitive faculty and reasoning, like this constant communication. Lexi said, I think I've heard a perspective before that was something like the body's the underworld, and that stuck with me. Yeah, and I mean, that's kind of what I think this text is saying. And it does say later that, like, it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone's in Hades. Like, this sort of idea of, like, it's a conceptual framework, right? Of, like, the soul is entombed, but being entombed doesn't necessarily mean, free. Like, it could be in prison, or it could be a vehicle, or it can be a chariot. There's all these different archetypes that we've talked about in this um in this radio hour before. I feel like the chariot's the one that I spent the most time with myself. But there's lots of ways to sort of think about the body, but I do think that, yeah, they're saying that this is true, that it is an underworld as well. And it says, I guess when I think of intuitive faculty, I don't feel that intuitive faculties are higher. Ah, yeah, the language. Yeah, and I'm kind of copying language that he uses here, but I really like that pushback that, like, thinking about it as necessarily higher kind of brings up, like, hierarchical. And I guess for me, it means, like, maybe outside of matter. So, like, not like this sort of like there's no gravity pulling it in to matter. So it feels like it's higher only, like, I think in that aspect of, at least how I'm kind of understanding higher the way that they are. To me, it feels like because we're sticking with this earth metaphor and this human body, and there's all this gravity, and we're part of Earth's body as well. Like, higher meaning like outside the body, um, the parts of us that are outside the body that are vaster or more subtle. Right, like it feels counterintuitive to me. And it says about like the idea of it being higher. Porter says that's how I understood it. Yeah, please feel free to come off of mute if anyone has anything like that, just to even like try to recapitulate or like share what's coming up or reflect or be like, yeah, this is nonsense, because that's always helpful too. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to go back to this for a second to see if there's one more piece I want to do to just like help tie this up. Oh, I wanted to bring this in too because I love the way that they talk about Nyx here. Let me check the chat real quick before I do that. Do 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 do. Hey, turquoise. Okay. And so yeah, like a lot of these, I'm just looking at my thread again, and that these mysteries have to do with like purification, also. And then this is sort of they act out these myths to help bring about some of that process of getting it out of the system, so to speak. But I'm going to go back to like, hey, turquoise is on my shoulder now. Thank you, sir. This is another quote from the text. Nyx, or the night, is with great beauty and propriety introduced in Claudian's retelling of the myth, of the Ceres myth, as standing by the nuptial couch and confirming the oblivious league. So it says night is there. Like they call out in Claudian when he does the poem of this myth, he calls out that night is right there, standing by, watching over Pluto's rape of Persephone, of this sort of like this union is coming together. For the soul, through her union with a material body, becomes an inhabitant of darkness and subject to the empire of night, in consequence of which the soul dwells wholly with delusive phantoms, until she breaks her fetters, is deprived of the intuitive perception of that which is real and true. And so, like, to me, this idea of like it's going into the underworld language and that night is there and talking about it's delusive. Like I think what I'm hearing is sort of like when you hear about Hades in these retellings, and even like in Dante's Inferno to a bit, but like in all these like retellings of Hades, like they're shades, they're called, and you know, there's a lot of nonsense going on. Like in one of my favorite myths, which is Psyche and Cupid, where Psyche ends up going down into the underworld as part of her sort of journey, and I think that myth also is pointing to a lot of these same themes. And so she goes down too and has to retrieve something from Persephone. But in order for her to do that, she has to avoid all these people that are trying to ask her to do things. So she has to like the only way she can get to the actual like reason in the underworld is to avoid all the distractions. In order for her to retrieve this, it's part of Persephone's beauty that's put into a box that she has to bring back up to Venus as part of her tasks to prove her worth in order to be wed to Cupid, her son, Eros, in that myth. And so to me, it's like, it's again, avoid distractions. Yes, Lexi, like, it's this idea that, like, the intuitive faculties, like the soul, all this is within the underworld, within the body, but there's a lot of ghosts, there's shades, there's distractions, there's delusions that are on the way there. And so in order for this to happen, like Psyche, she had, who is also the Greek word for soul, she had to go down into the underworld and safely avoid everything that's asking her for help, because everyone's asking her for help, and she has to keep saying no, and she also has to keep her hands full. So the other thing is people are trying to distract her and trying to take things and trying to take her attention so that she will let loose of the honey-soaked bread that she has, which she needs to feed the three-headed dog to get to Persephone, because he blocks the way, Cerebus. And so if she doesn't avoid everyone, she'll get trapped down there because she won't be able to get in and out. She needs bread for both to give to the Cerebus and to get out. So like this idea of like Psyche had when she makes her descent, she has to avoid all the distractions, and I feel like this text is saying the same thing, that if you're not careful when you're in Hades, you'll be trapped by shades, by ghosts, by things that are pulling you into different directions, pulling you into nonsense that isn't actually something that's real, that's on the way out of the underworld. So it's not saying that the underworld is necessarily bad, it's a necessary thing. But there's the realities in the underworld are a little bit more guarded, and the way there might be a little treacherous, which I think does explain at least my inner perspectives and some of the things that have bubbled up as I've tried to do this work, this sort of like soul work, so to speak. And it says, I feel like those are portals out, though. Interesting. Yeah, I'm curious what I see some fun energy I'm feeling in the chat. So I'm wondering if anyone wants to come off mute and share anything that's coming up for them.
I feel like it's so subtle to me, like whatever difference that I'm feeling into. So like, I appreciate your patience as I try and like tease it out, but
Sure.
um, I still, I'm still just feeling like there's like some like very like um kind of like minute distortion that I'm picking up on,
Mm.
and it's kind of like I feel like I may have talked about this in the death work thread that we have, but it's like even the words, like the associations that the words like trapped and like escape kind of evoke for me.
Mm.
Um I feel like they kind of I feel like they kind of shed light on like the distortion that I'm like trying to illuminate or like feeling into. Like,
Mm.
yeah, it's like as opposed to like the distractions and like the ghosts being like portals out of the underworld, it's like it has this energy of like, be careful,
Mm-hmm.
like you might get trapped.
Mm.
I don't know
Mm.
how to explain it, but
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of like it makes me feel like there's like there's like a certain amount of like, and this could just be me and like my associations, but it's like to me it feels like there's like fear and like avoidance
Mm.
that's coming through as opposed to like a full just like embrace and acceptance. I don't know, but like I said, this could just be like the reflections that I'm seeing of my
Yeah.
own self. Yeah.
No, I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, I think it's really fair to, because once we start using language like Taylor is doing in this book that connects the body to sort of themes that have a really negative or fear-based tone, it does sort of change the dynamic potentially and the relationship with the body, which I feel like is like a big, you know, thing we see in Western culture in terms of this separation of mind and body, of like, this sort of splitting off, separate from man and humanity and nature kind of language. And I do think that like, I mean, I feel like I was feeling into some of this too, in that like, and because you see this text a lot, like you see this theme a lot, and it is sort of because nowadays I feel like a lot of a lot of the work is like more somatic focused, because a lot of people are in need of being back into their bodies fully and living that fully embodied life. But I think a lot of the ancient texts often are speaking of the body as, like, in this case, like a prisoner, a kind of like a Hades in a way, for the soul, and others as like, like the chariot that is pulled by our senses, and that we're just sort of like at the whim of sensual pleasure and sensorial experience that can be at like that can go against our soul and can like really do harm to ourselves. And
Right. Whereas I feel like actually those things are like portals into the soul as opposed to away from them.
yeah, yeah, I agree. It's a really tricky thing, I feel like, but I totally agree. Like, because if you don't pay attention to those things, if you don't really fully feel into everything, you do miss out on opportunities to feel more embodied and connected with all parts of ourselves, and shedding the things that are just junk that we've accumulated or that's time to go. At least in my experience. I don't know if that resonates with what you're saying.
Yeah, I think it does for sure. Yeah.
But yeah, I appreciate you saying that. Like, and I think some of that language I brought in with when I was talking about Psyche and Cupid, and so like there's some blending. I think that was my fault in terms of like the way I was dramatizing the myth and then connecting it to this like higher or like deeper truth.
I don't really think it's your fault per se. Like I wouldn't put it like that. But I do
It's
feel
all
like
good.
it's kind of like I feel like it does shed light on like how the frame can how that framing of it can quickly kind of like pick up steam in a way.
Yeah, yeah, and it is funny too because like I feel like a lot of the stuff that I'm reading in this book, like I'm connecting it to themes in the New Testament and Christianity. And like the more I do that, the more I'm really starting, especially like I've been so helped by all these great conversations and readings in the Sharia Way book club and conversations happening in those threads in that channel. Um, but I really am like starting to see how Greek Christianity is. Um, because yeah, a lot of these themes, like, and I could see also similar to Christianity, how like the language of that religion could be used in a way that really is very separating and very like you're kind of like you're not using the word judgmental, but like this idea of like, oh, like everything, like this trap, this sort of escape, this sort of bad fear-based tactic, right? This idea that like if we don't do the right thing, we're doomed, you know. Um, And I feel like that is true, honestly, but it's true in such a more subtle way that it gets overblown by this sort of like language of hellfire and language of, hell and Hades. And if we don't do it, well, where our souls are lost, where it's like, it's more like happening for me in like the everyday moments. It's like hellfire, hot. I don't know, man. When I fuck up, I feel pretty damn hot. I start sweating in places I didn't even know I had sweat sometimes. If I'm really feeling like I'm on the hot seat, that sure does feel like Hades to me. Like I'm burning, especially if it's some shit that I knew I shouldn't have done or I got myself into. Like, damn, dude, you got here how? Why? Right? And I'm just feeling hot. So like, and then that happens, I think, by sort of not following the nudges within, and then we so like the idea of like this hellfire, I agree, like this fear, it's more like you'll feel it. Like you'll get the consequences pretty immediately. You don't have to worry about like some future hell state. Like it's gonna happen pretty soon, at least in my experience, when we really step out of ourselves. I'll stop for that because I feel like I got on a soapbox there, but Oh, did you want to share anything off mute? Or I can read this, but I feel like I don't know if it'll do it justice to what I feel like you're coming up with. Mm. Oh, okay. No worries. So I'll read from the chat. She says, I feel like also it's very reflective of the language of the times. Yeah. Like if only we could go back in time to let them know about embodiment the way we do now. It's a framework from my perspective. It's not that disconnected from my perspective. Yeah. It's like a warning itself. Isn't the tragedy we're being warned about is what comes up for me. Mm. Hmm. Yeah. And Anna says, there's still a preoccupation with the light to me. Ah, there's always go to the light. Yeah, yeah. The light and love, the light and love kind of language. Although I will say the Greek, I would not say are light and love types. They do fall victim to the light, I think, motif. But the love, not so much, because Venus is often painted as like someone that'll get you into some shit that isn't. It's not necessarily helpful. Um, but they do love the underworld. Like this, like Hoda says, wait, they love the underworld. Yeah, like I don't think they're necessarily saying. I think they're saying this is all part of the process. Like it's not that it's bad and fear based. It's just that it is. And I feel like the sooner people recognize the fact that they have this dual life of underworld and divinity, human and divine, the easier things will be, hopefully, for them. With regards to how they see death, especially these mysteries are often talked about a lot as like helping to relieve the fear of death, because within them are these sacred messages of the divinity and the immortality and the eternity that we are, and that we are, yes, we're sharing this experience in this human body in a certain way, but that there is this other part that is eternal, that is one with everything. So I do feel like they're trying to tell us that this underworld experience isn't like a permanent state, nor is it something that we have to necessarily fear. I feel like Anna's still not convinced that they're giving enough ashay to the underworld, which I respect. I'm feeling that. I like, at least that's the vibe I'm feeling. She says, I'm really not, lol. Give more love to the underworld. Yes. I'm trying to figure out. So the other part of the text talks about the myth of Bacchus and Dionysus. And I'm wondering if like that makes sense to bring in at this point, or does that feel like we've had enough of this Greek stuff? It's all Greek to me, you know? So I'm just want to check in with people if we feel like this is a good, starting to be a good space to close, or if we want to bring in this Bacchus Dionysus part of the book too. I feel like that could wait. That could definitely wait. But it's a similar story, you know. This idea, this other mystery of Bacchus is about the soul retrieval and like reconnecting within and all this communication. And so actually, you know what? I am feeling a little bit more like, especially because Anna is really like wanting to give love to the underworld. And I feel like that is something that we do a lot here in different ways, where we've been giving more love to. And I feel like in this space too, we brought in Yama a couple times, but especially when we read the Katha Upanishad, where he divulges secrets that only death can. So I kind of want to know. I kind of want to end it not with more like this kind of stuff, what this text or whatever, these myths, but more our own cosmologies, our own practices, um, like what we feel like our relationship is with this language of underworld and body, And yeah, just anything that comes up with those regards of how some of the things we've talked about, whether it's communication with the soul, whether it's this sort of spiritual descent and re-ascent, that motion. Maybe we just speak generally to how that motion has showed up in your practice or your own cosmology. Sorry, I'll restate the question. The question was, um, I'd love to hear how some of this relates to your own practices or cosmologies. Not just anything that came up today, but I would say anything that even is loosely related to some of the things we've discussed, like the underworld and how that maybe has shown up in your own cosmology or practice, or this sort of motion of a descent of soul and a reascent, or just even a descending and an ascending. What it says, it feels alive for me. I feel like it's also something I can relate to, mostly because I feel like the story relates to nature. Yeah, and cosmic cycles from my perspective. Oof. Yeah, and like he doesn't really get too deep into cosmic perspectives, but he does touch on it loosely about the way that these deities are also related to celestial bodies. And I find it really interesting the way he talks about Pluto and how I'm going to read this one part one more time just to like get it right, because I find it interesting. But he says Pluto, Hades, signifies the whole of a material nature, since the empire of this god, according to Pythagoras, commences downward from the galaxy or the Milky Way. So this idea that like commences downward from the Milky Way or galaxy. Like, I just find that really interesting because Pluto hadn't been discovered when this guy was writing this. So at this point that he's writing this, Pluto has no association with the dwarf planet, which is now like in our own understanding like the furthest out planet. At least how most of us grew up and were told like in grade school the planets, right? Back when Pluto was still a planet, which we'll not get into, but I just find that really interesting. He's talking about this connection that Pluto has with the Milky Way galaxy, which I always kind of like connect back to like Sagittarius A and like the center point of the galaxy. But anyway, like I find it really interesting that Pluto is the furthest planet and it's sort of like a cosmic gateway, if you will, into this incarnation process, and that it's coming up in this way in this text before the planet had been named. So I think there's also like I'm thinking of like some why am I like this transmissions Nubo had shared about like the naming of celestial bodies, and that's some of that's coming up right now regarding the cosmic cycles that Hoda said. Sorry, there's a long tangent there. And then there's some conversation in the chat about like the distortions of the Romans and their rhetoric. Yes, and it says, I feel like maybe the Romans themselves didn't have distortions, but I feel like the way their rhetoric has been applied since has caused a lot of distortion. Yeah. Yeah. Whew. Didn't say that again. But yeah, going back to that question, wanted to see if anyone has anything else that they might want to share about how they're some things that they do in their own practice or their own cosmologies of their own incarnation might relate to some of the things we talked about, or like this language of the underworld. So what it is, it's about. Oh, hold on. Do you have something you want to share? Oh, no worries. You got a hot mic. All right, I'm seeing some chat stuff. I'll hold a little bit longer. Oh, no worries. The accidental unmute happens to me all the time. I guess the last thing I'll say too, and like I do hope this this text and some of these excerpts were useful, but just wanted to make one last shout out for some upcoming conversations to continue this idea of communication with the unseen realities in ways that can be supportive, as well as maybe helpful tools and practices um, that others have used to help them with this communication and to help them with sort of the distracting or the forces or the not forces. I don't want to introduce fear, but like the unseen realities that maybe are less helpful, which I would say are not realities necessarily in the real world. They are distortions, right? At least in the context that like I'm using that word. And so hopefully this has been helpful, but if not, I'm going to be having some wonderful guests. We're going to have a new time and day, and I don't think it'll be really archetypal hour, but I just want to say to those listening to this that we're going to have two great conversations, one with Hoda and one with Nobu, about this and about their own work on this communication, talking about sort of what that looks like in terms of also bringing in things like angels, deities, as well as the language of demon, right? And what that looks like to be able to uh, receive transmissions, receive the signal, right, of the reality, um, as opposed to all the noise that we might pick up instead, or that might make it harder for us to make clear the communication happening at those subtle levels, um, as well as also the way that our work with ancestors and ancestral perspective plays into that process of receiving all this communication and then communicating back, um, especially through our actions and through our embodied life. Thank you all. And I really appreciate this space. And we will talk soon. Thank you for those that are listening asynchronously.